So now let's move on to our second novel. Our second novel is one of my favorite novels of all time and one of the defining works of post-war American fiction. And it's by Ken Kesey, published in 1962. It's called One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Now, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, the novel, is actually not as famous as the film that it was later adapted into, but I've always liked the novel a little bit better for a couple of reasons. First of all, the language itself is incredibly beautiful and well written in this novel. So Ken Kesey, I think, is a really masterful writer because he can be full of satire and wit and cynicism and, be really harsh against what he's writing against, but he can also write passages of sheer grace and beauty, and it's really that contrast of styles that I really enjoy in this novel. Second of all, it's part of my favorite period of literature. So my favorite era of literature is post-war American fiction. So sort of like American novels that were published between 1950 and the late 70s. That's my favorite time, and I'll get into why later. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, as I said just then, is one of the defining works, one of the master works of that period. So it's going to be good if it's all those things combined. So the way I'm going to teach this novel is I'm going to split it up into 6 videos, and this is the first of 6 videos. And how it's going to be split up is like this. This first video will be about the context of the novel. So I'll take you through some of the large contextual ideas surrounding the novel. I'll take you through Ken Kesey and his influences. The second, third, fourth, and fifth part will each cover one of the parts of the novel. So the novel is quite long. I think it's about 300 pages long, but Ken Kesey has divided it into 4 parts, which are all distinctly different. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Those next 4 videos are going to be mainly about dissecting each of those parts, pulling out a few quotes and sections, and, analyzing them with you. The final part is going to be more of a summary a summary video, and the summary video is going to be more like what do I think Ken Kesey is trying to say? What is his big message? What is the big picture ideas, and what argument is he trying to make overall? And it'll just wrap up the book nicely for you to maybe, if you're studying in the future, it's something you can come back to and revise just to get a quick catch up on all the main ideas of this novel. With that being said, let's launch into our first part, which is the context. Now, I always loved context the most. Context is always the part of the novel that I find the most interesting, even though it's actually not the novel itself, right? It's a bit funny. I really love how the outside world and history and all the other things directly influence what we can see in the novel. And I think that's really, really true for this novel, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. The general contextual information you have to understand about this novel is that it's mainly 3 elements, okay? The first element is that it's post-war American. The second element is that it's postmodernist. And the third element is that it's existentialist. Now, those are very big words. I'm sure some of you haven't heard of those before, but I'll break those down and hopefully you'll be able to understand where this novel is coming from a little bit better. So the first one, post-war American. So this novel was written at a time in America about a decade and a half after World War II. Now, World War II, by most accounts, is the most horrific event that has ever happened to humanity, right? So not only did we see the levels of deaths that we saw in World War I, so in terms of number, but we also saw some of the greatest and most horrific atrocities committed by humanity in that period. So I'm talking about things like the Holocaust. I'm talking about things like the United States dropping the atomic bomb on Japan. Atrocities that humanity has never seen before, and to the scale of which humanity has never seen before. And what this resulted in is great disillusionment with institutions. What are institutions? Institutions are basically organizations that control or hold power in society. So, for example, the government is an institution, the university is an institution, things like that. And basically why this occurred was, imagine if you were living in a world, and this is the real world, this is not a fantasy world. You're living in the time of World War II. World War II just happened. You're meant to trust the government, right? The American government, for example. But the American government is the same set of leaders that decided to kill hundreds of thousands of people in Japan, make an entire area unlivable, and unleash upon the world the greatest, most dangerous weapon this world has ever seen. Lots of people saw these events that happened in World War II and decided, you know what, I can no longer trust these institutions and these positions and these people who are in positions of power. So, what happened then is obviously people began to distrust or become disenchanted or disillusioned with people in positions of authority. So politicians, for example, people who lead certain study faculties. So at university, for example, the people who were leading politics units that were called into question. People were doubting all sorts of things, religion as well, all sorts of different faculties of society. Now, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest is set in a mental asylum. So it's set in basically a hospital for insane people where they're trying to treat them. And one of the characters you'll meet right at the very start of the novel is this authoritarian figure in this little mini institution of the mental asylum. Her name is Nurse Ratched. Now, Nurse Ratched is meant to represent the terrible authority. She's meant to represent the type of authority that people were revolting against. There's someone who has full control over a situation and has no checks and balances on her power. And Ken Kesey was trying to materialize his influences in his context in terms of like being disillusioned with authority into this figure of Nurse Ratched, who is meant to be almost like a satirically bad character. So just a reminder of what satire is. This is definitely a satirical novel as well. So satire is basically when someone exaggerates something or pushes something to the extreme in order to make a joke or a political comment. And Ken Kesey's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest is definitely political in the way that it depicts Nurse Ratched and how she treats the members of the hospital. So that's why post-war American is the first element of the novel. A couple of other elements. The second element that you need to keep in mind is that it's definitely a postmodernist novel. So postmodernism is a movement in literature that responded to some of the ideas that I was talking about in terms of post-war attitudes. So post-war attitudes, as a reminder, is just stuff like not trusting authority, not trusting institutions. And authors at the time were trying to figure out, well, how do I actually make that idea apparent in my novel, in my works of literature, in my plays? How do I convey that through the form of the play? So I hope you guys understand what form means, but basically it's saying, how can I make those ideas apparent in the way I write my novel, not just what the novel is about? Anyone can write a novel saying, I hate authority, I hate institutions, but some of these authors were trying to figure out, well, how do I actually make it clear in the way that I write it? So lots of postmodernist authors decided to break down the authorities in terms of literary standards. What does that mean? They took a lot of the conventions of literature, so traditional ways of writing literature, and broke them all down, mushed them up, and came up with their own style. Some of these features of this postmodernist style of writing include a non-linear narrative. So linearity in a novel is what we consider when a story has a start and a finish, and it goes from start to finish, right? So think of a novel like Harry Potter. Harry, I'm not too familiar with Harry Potter, but, joins Hogwarts, he goes through all these things, and then he defeats Voldemort at the end, right? It's just a linear novel because it goes from start to finish. Lots of postmodernist novels actually did the opposite. They jumped all around. They started at, halfway through the story, they jump to near the end, and they go back, and they go back again, that sort of thing. That's called a non-linear novel. They also did other things. So, for example, one of the most common techniques that you'll see in postmodernist novels, and definitely in this one, is the idea of pastiche. Pastiche, spelt P-A-S-T-I-C-H-E, is the idea that postmodernists like to combine different types and different styles of text together. So in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, you'll see, places where the language is very loose and informal because he's writing from the perspective of some character, and he's using a lot of slang, a lot of hippie slang, which we'll get into later as well, what that means. But also some other parts, he'll use very formal, highfalutin, florid language, and he's combining these different styles of writing together. So, for example, if you read a Victorian novel, right, by Jane Austen, the entire novel is written in the same tone. It's the same tone of voice, right? But in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, you have a wide range of types of voices, and that's part of postmodernism as well. The other thing is different text types. So in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, you'll see all sorts of different things. There'll be, fragments of lyrics where people are singing. There'll be drawings as well, different sketches. So Ken Kesey is combining both text styles and text types into his postmodernist novel. Third element you have to understand is that this novel is deeply existentialist. Now, existentialism is a very complicated branch of philosophy, and I'm not going to try to explain everything about existentialism to you right now. In fact, I'm actually studying that in university, so I don't even understand it completely. But existentialism is basically a movement, at least in the 20th century, that also sprung up out of the war. And it was the idea that, well, because we can't trust in authorities anymore, right? We can't trust in the people who govern us, then where do we get our meaning? So traditionally, people got meaning from their authorities, right? Think of people who follow the church all the time. They're Christians, the meaning of my life is to be a good Christian. That's their source of meaning in their life. Or, for example, someone who is really into politics. The meaning of my life is that I support Labour Party. I'm a real Labour Party loyalist, for example, right? But in the post-war era, when we cannot trust the institutions, where do we get our meaning from? And part of existentialism, at least in the 20th century, was this revitalization, this rebirth of humanism. What does humanism mean? Humanism is a focus on the individual. Focus on the individual feeling, emotion, relationships. These things that matter to individuals, but not to a big institution like a government, right? So there was a lot of focus on how people felt, how people personally experienced the world, but also about the people, the little guy, right? Like not the world leaders and the people with power, but just the regular man. And the regular man being important as well because of his own subjective experience and his relationships. So it was a lot about horizontal relationships in existentialism, how we relate to each other rather than how we relate to the people above us. So it's not a vertical relationship. And Ken Kesey's novel is definitely about that. Why? Because it depicts a very marginalized population. So marginalized means people who are oppressed or disadvantaged. People who are insane, who are locked up in a mental asylum, are obviously marginalized, right? Like they are the most vulnerable, powerless people in society, okay? But what Ken Kesey is trying to prove through this novel is that even though these people are crazy and they don't have power and they can't do anything about it, doesn't mean that they're not human. And although Nurse Ratched in the novel tries to dehumanize people by, treating them as objects and treating them as test subjects for her little, mental hospital experiments, what Ken Kesey is trying to prove is that even in this situation, every single one of these insane people is still, at the end of the day, a person, a human being, someone who has their own subjective experiences and feelings that are important to consider. So now that you know generally the contextual ideas of the novel, let's get into a couple of little specifics about Ken Kesey and the novel himself. So Ken Kesey was born in 1935 in Oregon, which is right at the west edge of America. It's actually really pretty close to upper United States, so like Canada. And it's a little logging town, not really anything special about it. But his experiences definitely came to him, and the motivation and the inspiration to write the novel definitely came to him when he was in university. So Ken Kesey was a very talented creative writer. He graduated from Stanford with a creative writing degree, and the inspiration for One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest actually came when he worked as a night aide at a veterans hospital. So a night aide is just like a nurse, someone who goes around, helps clean up and, give people their medication. Not a doctor, just someone who helps out, right? Because he really needed money at the time and he was quite poor. So when he was working at a night aide at this veterans hospital, a secret underground government program was being run where they were testing on these veterans sort of different types of new psychoactive drugs. So veterans are obviously people who have come back from the war, who have fought. Often lots of them are suffering from different mental conditions like PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, where they can't, get rid of a very, very traumatic memory that they had. And that's why the government was trying to test on these people new types of psychoactive drugs. So psychoactive drugs are like they make you hallucinate and things like that. They include things like psilocybin, which is found in magic mushrooms, and also LSD, which is also known as acid. And Ken Kesey found this type of experimentation very shocking because it dehumanizes people, right? These are veterans that have come back and fought for America as a free country, right? They fought in the United States. They are just about to fight in Korea and Vietnam and things like that. But they're just being treated like lab rats, like mice who are, being subjected to all sorts of different types of, take this drug, see what it does for you, right? They're not being treated like human beings who have their own individual importance. And he wanted to write a novel kind of protesting against that. Also, it's important to know that Ken Kesey kind of falls in the in-between between the 50s beatnik culture and the 60s hippie culture. So the beatniks were a group of writers who really kickstarted this post-war literature movement, okay? So they include people like Jack Kerouac, who wrote On the Road, and people like that, who really kickstarted that, as well as poets like, Allen Ginsberg and people like that. And Ken Kesey, he's not quite getting into literature at the time when the beatniks were still around, but he's just coming into literature as the hippie culture was emerging. Now, hippie culture in the 60s is basically, this idea of a liberation of the mind. So people are taking lots of drugs, there's a lot of sexual freedom, things like that. And Ken Kesey kind of falls in between the two because he's writing from a beatnik sort of training because, the people he was reading when he was writing his novel were the beatniks. But he's also emerging into this new type of culture called the hippie culture, and he's combining those two elements together. So in the novel, you'll notice there's a lot of hippie slang and things like that. So if you do need to look up any terms, feel free to ask me, or you can also look it up online. Now, hopefully that gives you a good enough summary of the context of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Now, as you head into reading part 1, because part 1 is quite long, I think it's like 120 pages long, what I want you to think about is this. Why do you think Ken Kesey chose to set his novel in a mental asylum? Okay, and how does that relate to the context? So that's the question that I want you to try to answer while you're reading that first part. Now, if you could please send the answers to the WeChat group, I'll try to reply as best and as quickly as I can. Thank you very much, and I'll see you later this week when we talk more about part 1.